The difference between appearance and reality has been a recurring theme in the philosophy from the beginning. How else, after all, could Thales, the one who is often credited as the first Western philosopher, how could Thales come to the conclusion that water was the basic reality? Man, sure, water is important. Water is found many places. But the idea that everything is ultimately water, if that's the reality, well, things sure don't appear that way. Differentiating between appearance and reality goes way beyond Thales. It's with us from the very beginning of humanity and before. We look at a newly discovered plant, it has fruit, looks tasty. That's its appearance. But is it tasty? Is it good for us? Is it good for us whether tasty or not? Does its reality match up with its appearance? In Plato's Republic, Plato depicts his brother Glaucon in conversation with Socrates. Socrates would really like to put the emphasis on reality. It is much more important, he thinks, for us to be really good, to be really righteous. Glaucon isn't so sure. Glaucon thinks that people go for mere appearance of being righteous, of being good. And appearing to be good, well, that's good enough for him. As we read the Republic, we then hear the story of the ring of Gyges. Now you will immediately note that the ring pictured in the PowerPoint is not the ring of Gyges. It's the One Ring made by Sauron from the books of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's not the same ring, but it has a similar power to make the wearer invisible. How would you like to be invisible? Would that be a useful power to have? The key question here is, how would your behavior change if no one could see it was you doing it? Do the gaze and knowledge of others have any effect on your actions? Haidt is convinced that they do. Haidt claims that an essential realization, if we are going to have a good moral practice in the world, is that our reputation is always on the line. If my reputation is always on the line, never some sort of inner reality that has been decided once and for all, then I must continually give an account of myself. I must answer to the people around me. If I know that I must give an account of my actions to the people around me, then in theory, I will pay closer attention to the responses of people around me so that I'm more likely to appear righteous to them. I cannot settle with only appearing righteous to myself. Phil Tetlock identifies two kinds of reasoning. The first is exploratory thought. The second, confirmatory thought. A more recent writer that you may have encountered is Julia Galef. She speaks of a scout mindset and a soldier mindset. Her scout mindset is roughly equivalent to Tetlock's exploratory thought, while the soldier mindset that she writes about is roughly equivalent to Tetlock's confirmatory thought. Exploratory thought wants to look at everything. Exploratory thought begins with a hunger for truth and an assumption that we don't already have it all. Exploratory thought, as the name implies, explores, looking everywhere for evidence that will help it find the truth. Confirmatory thought is different. Confirmatory thought starts with the assumption that it is correct and looks for evidence to confirm and defend its correctness. Can you guess which of these kinds of thinking comes most naturally to us? Can you also guess which of these kinds of thinking we want other people to think we're engaging in? This is why Haidt says we're more inclined by nature to act the politician looking for support than the scientist looking for truth. How does accountability play into this? Haidt has already said that our awareness of being accountable to others is necessary. Is it a magic solution? Well, apparently not. Tetlock specifies 3 conditions in which accountability can shift us from confirmatory thinking to exploratory thinking. First, we know from the beginning that we will be accountable to others. Second, we don't know in advance what the people will be giving an account to believe. It could be anybody, they can believe anything. And number 3, we believe the audience is well informed and interested in accuracy, but maybe not primarily interested in us being right. They want the truth. Have you ever seen a politician's press secretary in action? The press secretary's job is producing and controlling spin. In Haidt's elephant and rider metaphor, the rider is the press secretary for the elephant. It's the rider's job to explain and defend the actions of the elephant. Or, dropping the metaphor, it's the job of our reasoning to explain and defend the actions flowing from our automatic moral intuitions. This is where we run into motivated reasoning. Going back to Tetlock, we are motivated to seek confirmation of our intuitions. It's not just my intuition. It's not just my thought. It's not just my judgment, my gut reaction. It is the truth. It is what is right. We want to know that. So we look for evidence in the world that confirms our current position. We avoid evidence that might counter it. You're biased in that direction. In the PowerPoint, I give you a cartoon strip of Dilbert. Dilbert's interacting with one of his coworkers. She starts by saying, "Let's begin the meeting, but be aware that I am documenting all of your bullying behavior." Dilbert responds, I'm not even close to being a bully, but now your confirmation bias will make everything I say sound like bullying to you. And the strip shows her typing away on her phone. And she says, "Can you repeat the part after you implied that I'm a delusional witch?" Yeah, it's an example of motivated reasoning, of confirmatory reasoning. When we want to believe something, we can ask the question, can I believe this? This question leads us to look for evidence that confirms what we want to believe. When we don't want to believe something, we ask a different question. We ask, must I believe this? This question directs the search toward evidence that disconfirms what we don't want to believe. Haidt says that if we really want to produce morally good behavior, we have 2 choices. Educating the rider won't help so much. We have to focus on the elephant. First option then would be to change the elephant. This is really hard. It takes time. The second option is to design the environment. If we design the elephant's environment in such a way as to provide built-in incentives and disincentives, we might be able to steer the elephant in the right direction. In my day job as a pastor, I try to do both of these. I think both are essential, though both are hard and both face increasing societal resistance. If you want me to say more, just ask me sometime, email me. My first real job was working at McDonald's. I started working there when I was in high school and continued through my college years. I managed to be part of the crew opening 2 different stores just north of Houston. Overall, it was a good experience for me. I'm still willing to eat at McDonald's, but I am happy that I don't smell like a hamburger when I get home from work these days. If a person wants to advance in the McDonald's hierarchy, that person will eventually take courses at their hamburger university. When Haidt talks about getting his PhD at McDonald's, that's not what he's talking about, however. Rather, it was through conversations with people at McDonald's that he was exposed to people who didn't think like he did. He discovered the difference when he asked McDonald's customers some of his harmless taboo violation questions. When asked to explain what was wrong, say with having sex with a frozen chicken carcass before eating it, or eating your pet dog that's been roadkill, they didn't understand his request. His interlocutors thought there must be something wrong with him if he couldn't see the obvious problems with each of these situations. Haidt had encountered a different moral world at McDonald's. By world standards, I guess I'm a weird person. No, this isn't because of my personal idiosyncrasies, which are plenty. The acronym WEIRD describes the cultural background I come from. We who are weird are, in terms of our primary culture, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Do you know very many weird folks? The problem with weird isn't that there are weird people. The problem is the lack of awareness of the phenomenon. Most psychology experiments are done by scholars who are academics working in the field of psychology. Well, duh. Where do we find most of these scholars? Most are found on college and university campuses. The more elite the college, the more likely the students are to be weird in their cultural orientation. Considering my own cultural makeup, I've had a lot of weird socialization, but I've also been affected by other cultures. First, my dad was in the Navy when I was growing up. Military culture, even for military kids, can be somewhat different than civilian culture. Living in Japan and Korea also broadened my experiences. Second, my Christian commitment puts me at odds with some elements of weird culture, especially as weird culture becomes more secular. These psychological researchers have a ready supply of willing subjects for their experiments as they explore how people think and how psychology works. This sample pool is the students on their campuses. With the advent of the awareness of the weird phenomenon, they are finally coming to see that the findings of those studies are worth less than they originally thought. Since their sample population is skewed, they cannot assume that findings based only on this population, on weird students, are valid necessarily for all other populations or for humans in general. The moral culture of weird people is a distinct moral culture. From Haidt's scientific point of view, this is neither good nor bad. It simply is. Our awareness of its distinctiveness as a moral culture and not as the way everyone is what we're focusing on. Weird people are highly individualistic. That's no surprise, after all, since that's what the I stands for in weird. They're not just individualists in their understanding of themselves, however. There's a broader phenomenon of atomization at work here. It's not just people that are individuals, things defined on their own in isolation from every other thing. Everything in the world is an individual, an atom in that way. This tendency inclines weird people to an analytic outlook. They're more likely to take things apart than to put them together. The weird moral culture produced systems like utilitarianism that we associate with John Stuart Mill, the deontology of Kant, both systems that are rooted in individualism, rule-based, and looking for a universalistic approach, something that applies to everyone, everywhere, under any conditions. Do you remember the first principle of moral psychology? We saw it earlier in this presentation. Intuitions, that is gut reactions, come first. Strategic reasoning or justification for those intuitions or gut reactions, that comes second. At this point in discussion, Haidt gives us a second principle. Morality is about more than issues of harm and fairness. If the weird moral culture did define everyone, then it might be the case that morality was only about harm and fairness. But there are multiple moral cultures. Some of our moral concerns are activated in childhood. Others are activated through our education and experiences in life. The US is a large country. While weird people may dominate on at least some college campuses, there are many other moral matrices, sets of moral ways of looking at the world in our country. Our deep embedding in our moral matrices can make us blind to moral concerns of people in other moral matrices. Moral monism is the attempt to ground all of morality on a single principle. So far, embedded as he is in weird culture, Haidt has been looking at harm as a suggested single principle of morality. His cross-cultural work keeps showing him that this is an inadequate account. Of course, he need not draw this conclusion. When confronted with different principles in other cultures, he has other options. He could, for instance, declare that although these issues in other cultures appear to be dealing with morality, the reality is that they are dealing with something else. After all, we learn in our weird culture, morality simply is a matter of avoiding harm. But Haidt has another option. He could, again, from within the moral matrix of weird culture, simply declare that those other cultures are primitive, uninformed, or bigoted. Moral monism is a form of ethical absolutism. It says our understanding of the foundations of morality, avoiding harm, is the correct one. All others are wrong. Notice that this absolutist perspective is compatible with relativism in other dimensions. If you're a basketball player, maybe I can get by with this metaphor. In the moral monism of weird culture, avoiding harm is the pivot foot. As long as you keep that foot immobile, pretty much anything goes. Rejecting moral monism, Haidt suggests the metaphor of moral taste buds. As to literal taste, what our tongues do with food, we have 5 taste receptors. When I was a kid, I learned 4. Salt, sweet, sour, and bitter. In recent years, they've added umami. Different cuisines, and cuisines are connected to cultures, major on different tastes and mixes of taste. As he makes his case for moral foundations theory, Haidt argues for 6 moral taste receptors. Like food taste receptors, these moral taste receptors are shaped by culture, history, and environment. We've already seen Haidt mention the foundations of his moral foundations theory. The first foundation is the care-harm foundation. We've already gotten the idea how important this foundation is for moralities in weird cultures. This foundation, he says, had its beginning in child raising. Mammals, including humans, make a big investment in their young. The system of childcare tries to provide 2 things in balance, both protection and room for exploration. As you might suppose, at birth, the system is totally oriented around protection, as the child is utterly helpless. As the child matures and moves toward gaining independence and starting the reproduction cycle over, there's more orientation toward allowing exploration and self-directed learning. This foundation of morality is common to both liberals and conservatives, 2 words that we use to describe positions on our political spectrum. Though it might be that it appears to be more central for the former, for liberals, than for conservatives. Liberals are those who care about caring for people and not harming people. But this dimension, this moral foundation, I would say, is expressed differently by each of our political tribes. Liberals tend to apply the foundation broadly. Conservatives might do it for those who are have sacrificed for the group or for those who are part of our tribe. We can also see it at work in the way some conservatives approach the immigration debate, talking about protecting children and other vulnerable groups from predatory illegal immigrants, while liberals may tend to talk about protecting the children of vulnerable immigrants struggling to safety across the border. Second foundation is the fairness versus cheating foundation. In the PowerPoint on egoistic ethics, we'll look at egoism and altruism. Egoism is the push to pursue self-interest. Altruism, the push to pursue other interest. The easiest kind of altruism is that directed toward kin, toward those that we're related to, our family. We have a built-in desire to care for our own family members. The hard kind of altruism is that directed toward non-kin. Altruism towards strangers can be especially difficult. Again, both liberals and conservatives build the moralities from this foundation. Again, however, they come at it differently. When liberals look at fairness, they tend to seek out equality. Everyone needs to be treated the same. Maybe even everybody should have the same outcome. The conservative approach looks at fairness in terms of proportionality, with each person getting what they're due. If you work harder, you get more. It's only fair. The third foundation is the loyalty and betrayal foundation. Haidt tells us of a famous experiment, the Robbers Cave experiment done back in the 1950s. It shows that humans have tribalistic instincts. There seem to be more powerful in males than in females, though loyalty is important to both sexes. Conservatives, at least in our current culture, tend to be more explicit about using this foundation. Patriotism in its various expressions is valued more highly on the right. It is more common on the left these days to see loyalty to one's nation as parochialism. It's better from their perspective sometimes to be loyal to all of humanity. In recent years, there has been a move toward emphasizing loyalty toward certain oppressed subgroups in the population. The next moral foundation is the authority subversion foundation. This foundation is built on the notion that the world and society are in some way hierarchical. It is important within morality to work properly within this hierarchy. This foundation works in two directions, seeking proper relationships upward and downward. It is often assumed that conservatives are the ones who build on this foundation, eager as they are for everyone to submit to authority. Liberals, on the other hand, see themselves as the counterculture, bent on questioning and subverting authority. The imbalance in use of this foundation between conservatives and liberal moralities is, I believe, temporary. As liberals gain cultural ascendancy, it will be more important to them that we submit to their authority. One place we see this is in the debate over climate change. Science has spoken, we're told. We need to submit to science, lest we all die. I've also seen this in response to the pandemic. We'll also see conservatives switching over to more subversive approach to authority. We can see this in their current complaints about elites. Some difference will remain between the ways the two tribes handle this foundation. At least one important segment of the conservative tradition is the conviction that society is and should be made up of various institutions. These institutions include things like marriage, family, church, school, business, unions, etc. These institutions help structure a healthy and harmonious society. In this aspect of the conservative tradition, cultures that have been influenced by Confucianism look strongly conservative. Filial piety, one of the chief virtues in Confucianism, focuses on maintaining right relationships within social hierarchies. The fifth moral foundation that Haidt identifies is sanctity degradation. In this foundation, we come to the element of disgust that Haidt hinted at with his harmless taboo violations. He tells the story of Armin Meiwes. Meiwes advertises for a well-built 21 to 30-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. Bernd Brandes, though he didn't fully fit the ad, showed up and was willing. Maivis made sure Brandes was fully consenting to the activity, and then he did what he said he was going to do. What can we say about this? Nasty? Disgusting? Inhumane? I don't have any trouble saying any of those things. But in our modern ethos, drawn from John Stuart Mill, with its emphasis on the importance of personal autonomy, what do we make of it? As long as we don't harm someone else, we are to be allowed full autonomy to do as we please. This, by the way, is one of the arguments used in favor of euthanasia. It's not murder, as long as the person being euthanized wants to die. And some would say if Brandes wants to be killed and eaten, that's his right. This utilitarian view that maximizes individual free choice has trouble making sense of the moral foundation of sanctity and degradation. This is another foundation that is treated differently by our two main political tribes. It is more central to conservative moral thinking, but liberals find it important too. Again, the two tribes employ it in different ways and in relation to different phenomena and entities. The last moral foundation that Haidt mentions is the liberty oppression foundation. In his earlier studies, Haidt and his team had missed what he's calling this liberty oppression foundation. Some of its features were lined up under the other foundations. Considering all the evidence, he now sees usefulness in separating it out. This foundation originated with the challenge of living in small groups. While allegiance to the leader was important, sometimes the leader became oppressive. There's a natural tension between this foundation and the authority foundation. Groups needed to find ways to get out from under oppressive leaders. This foundation is shared by political liberals and conservatives, though expressed again differently by each. Liberals tend to approach it from the angle of demanding equality, while conservatives look primarily for liberty. You can see examples of this difference in some of today's political issues. When liberals point to income and wealth inequality and the need to do something about it, this moral foundation is in view. Similarly, when conservatives hear of healthcare strategies that put the government in place of their own choice of what kind of coverage they want, they too are appealing to this foundation when they resist. So we now have the full complement of moral foundations. We have care, harm, liberty, oppression, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, and degradation. The left, a term treated as functionally synonymous with liberal, builds its concept of morality mostly on the first three. Libertarians, who are in some way similar to both sides, the right and the left, build their system almost entirely on the liberty oppression foundation. Conservatives, or as they're sometimes called, the right, build their morality on all six foundations. It's important to note here that we're talking about the groups in general terms. Not all members of these groups, whether liberals, libertarians, or conservatives, would feel comfortable with the way they've been characterized in Haidt's work. The pragmatics of getting elected and gaining political power affect how groups work. So does the history of relationships among people. It's also the case that people are commonly members of multiple moral communities. For example, a person can be a member of a Christian, Jewish, or secular moral community while being a participant in any of these three types of political group. So don't expect uniformity. The best strategy is to pay attention and to seek understanding by careful study, careful listening, and careful ongoing engagement.